Okay, why don't we get started? So, welcome everybody, and welcome back to the series, the second half of this 8-part series that we're doing with Mark Schenker on this series of great novels spanning 100 years, all written by American women from Willa Cather all the way up to 2020, I think, is the latest year of publication. I'll skip all the intro. I think we all know Mark. I see pretty much lots of names of people who were coming to this for in April and into May. Once again, use the Q&A function to send any kind of a question or comment to me, which I will relay to Mark at the right time. He's going to start off with more or less a straight lecture, as he has done, and around 20 minutes or so, we'll see. If we're starting to get some commentary or some questions, we can take a break and handle those, but we can also play that a little bit by ear. But feel free, use the Q&A button, send me any questions or comments. The other thing I want to mention, I'll remind everybody, we will try yet again to have Mark in person in the library. We will also broadcast it by Zoom, but if there's enough interest to have him here for the final session on June 29, we'll do that with a little reception and a little greet and chat afterwards in person. As usual, I'll send everybody an email right after the third session, and you let me know if you'd like to come, and if there's enough interest, we'll do it. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Mark, and we will get started.
Thank you, Michael. Welcome, everybody. As always, I can see how many there are of you, but I can't see you or see your name. So welcome, everyone. And thanks again to Michael and the Wilton Library for continuing this mega series. I remind those of you who are returning, and I tell those of you who are new, that this series is called We Too Are Here, 100 years of, I'll call it, significant American novels by American women. And the significant is that the problem with the term great American novel is that it's been hijacked to suggest that there is a single great American novel. Often Moby Dick or The Great Gatsby is nominated for that position, and excuse the sense that there has to be something blatantly American, however you define that, about a novel. And I thought it was important to do a reset in the spring and now starting into the summer for these 8 books. And tonight we're doing Housekeeping, published in 1980, the first novel by the very prolific and excellent Marilynne Robinson. She was in her late 30s when she published this. It got a lot of attention. It won the Penn Hemingway Award. It was made into a major motion picture, as they say, in 1987, starring Christine Lottie as the Aunt Sylvie. And that got mixed reviews when it first came out, but has become something of a cult classic. And in my own experience, I know many people, I'm one of them, who is very fond of this novel. And I thought what I'd do, since although this is a slim book, it is not a simple book. And I think it's richer than many people reading it for the first time are aware of. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about what people expected from the book, what they first saw and what they saw eventually. Coming out in 1980, being called Housekeeping, having 3 generations of women in the story, having it be a novel very devoid of men. No applause, please, no applause. In fact, when the sheriff comes into the home, it's the first real sort of invasion or presence of a male. And of course, he's not only an authority figure, he's there to suggest that the family may be split up. So people expected, with the title Housekeeping and the brief description I just gave, that it would be a feminist novel. And many people read it as a celebration of Sylvie's eccentricity, a word that's often associated with her, and her bonding with Ruthie, and that they are marching to the beat of a different drummer. And it was very much reviewed and analyzed as a feminist novel. That's not to say that's not there, but it's not the only thing in the novel, and it may not be the most significant thing in the novel. I'd like to call your attention to how much this novel is suffused with loss. That's probably obvious to many of you, but maybe not as obvious as it might be. So I just want to summarize. The grandfather dies on page 6 in a spectacular derailment that nobody sees. So when I say that this book is loaded with loss, with death, with absences, with gaps, obviously the loss and death of the grandfather is one thing, but that no one saw it is another gap. That they cannot actually retrieve the train is another. That all they have from it is a suitcase, a seat cushion, and a lettuce, which of course is meant to be absurd. When Sylvie and Ruthie walk away on the bridge at the end, they're presumed dead. And again, that was something nobody saw. Helen goes into the water, and the boys who push her in her car see that happen. But there's no record of it being brought up. There are weddings that take place, but there are no snapshots of the wedding, of anyone's wedding. Sylvie has a husband. We're reminded several times in the book, at least once she seems to have to be reminded of it, Mr. Fisher. But there's no snapshot of that wedding. There's very little known about him. I think there's a pattern of loss. There's a pattern of gaps. They're in Idaho, a portion of the world we're told we're chastened by an awareness that the whole of human history has occurred elsewhere. It's a kind of place out of time. And so having read the books we read where we're either in major metropolitan areas or even when we're in the Midwest with My Antonia, there's a sense that this is an important locale in the story of America. Here we are, all due respect to Fingerbone, fictional, and Idaho, not fictional. Here we are in Idaho. Well, there are a lot more indications of gaps and loss. One is the opening of the novel, My Name is Ruth. The first person narrator introduces herself rather starkly. And I can't be the only person who hears in that first line an echo of Call Me Ishmael, the opening line of 1851 Moby Dick, a novel that may seem to have nothing in common with this. Call Me Ishmael is one of the most famous opening lines of all of literature, American or otherwise. And Ishmael, of course, is the son of Abraham and Hagar, and therefore not a legitimate son, and is banished into the desert. So Ishmael, the biblical prototype for the narrator of Moby Dick, is an outsider, often exile. Ruth, My Name is Ruth. She has the name of a non-Israelite who married an Israelite. And when he died and the other members of her family, male members of her family died, she was given the option by her mother-in-law, Naomi, to go back to her own family. Because Naomi said, I don't have other sons you can marry. I can't really figure out a way to keep you in my family. And Ruth, of course, said famously, where you go, I will go. Your people shall be my people. So unlike Ishmael, who is cast out, Ruth, although she's not cast out, is presumed to be leaving, and she stays. She stays with a mother figure, her mother-in-law. Well, that's a lot for a single sentence. But when you consider also that Ishmael is the only survivor, that is Melville's Ishmael, the only survivor of the whaling expedition from Moby Dick, and Ruth winds up being a survivor in her own way. Moreover, several times in the novel, Ruth refers to herself and her sister, or the hobos, that's the word that's used in the novel, they sometimes encounter, as marooned survivors. Twice she talks about her and the hobos being on the outskirts of town as marooned survivors, as if they've survived the shipwreck. Near the end, when there are several references to Noah's wife. And near the end, when they try unsuccessfully to burn down the house, Ruthie says that every house should be sort of converted into a vehicle or boat that you can move around. So early on, we have two things happening. One is lots of the regular aspects of life. By the beginning of the second chapter, no birth mothers are still present in the story. No men have been seen or have any presence. Some of them aren't even known. There is a grandmother who has died. There is a mother who has killed herself. There is another aunt who's off the grid in China. And there is Aunt Sylvie. The two maiden aunts on the father's side are meant to be caricatures. They're not independent people. And unlike the grandmother, their sister-in-law, they're not particularly competent in terms of domesticity. They finish each other's sentences. It's almost as if they're not a whole person. They come partly for financial benefit, and they're very eager to go when the going gets tough, and they are happy that Sylvie shows up. So in addition to the sense of loss, which is everywhere, the grandfather, we're told about his past before he died, found a pocket watch on the shore, and the crystal and the case were in good shape, even though the works were rotted out by rust. And so he painted on a circle of paper a picture that his wife was enamored of. So you have a pocket watch that tells no time, a pocket watch that has its space missing. It looks good, but it doesn't do what a pocket watch should do. And the grandmother is completely absorbed in wanting to see those seahorses. She likes looking at them so much that she wants to look at them even while she wants to see them, even as she's looking at them. That is, it's as if she can't get enough of looking. Whereas so much of the story is about not getting enough, about a kind of deprivation, a kind of absence of human relations or connection. And by the end of the novel, that's offered to Ruthie, not through her mother, who's gone, not through her sister, who has essentially turned her back on her, but through Sylvie. And they form this bond that is partly comic, but not comic in the way sometimes that the blurb on the back of the book talks about Sylvie. I think one of the refreshing things about her is she's not a quirky anti-Mame Rosalind Russell kind of character. She's something of a cipher herself. And when she and Ruthie go off, they're embracing a kind of lifestyle that you would not expect to be available to women in America in most any decade earlier than the book was published, and certainly not in the 1950s or so when it seems to be set. I'll say more. The novel has 11 chapters, and 11 is a famously incomplete number. 12 has a cultural, biblical, mythological, significant 12 signs of the zodiac, 12 months of the calendar, 12 nights of the round table. A day has 24 hours, but a clock has 12 hours. We just use it twice. So to have 11 gives a sense of incompleteness, an unfinished story. So there's that as well, including, as I said, that Sylvie has pinned in her clothes the story about the death of this aunt and niece, even though no one's seen it and no one's found any bodies. So the question becomes, what does the novel do with this litany of absences? And one of the things it does, it suggests that Ruthie is an extraordinary girl because she has a kind of transcendentalist nature by nature. One of the things that makes this novel American is that She says at one point in page 166 of the only edition that I know of, but maybe you have a different one. I have this edition, it's page 166. She says that the ordinary demanded unblinking attention. I'm going to repeat that. The ordinary demanded unblinking attention. So one aspect, one dimension of the book that was missed with the early reviewers who were thinking about the feminist import of it was that this girl has the ability to pay attention to the nature around her. She can imagine the life of her grandmother in great detail, and she does that. She remembers her mother's face and then replaces it with memories of Sylvie's place. She believes that the natural world, the world of spirit, and the world of society demand unblinking attention. That's the essence of transcendentalism. American transcendentalism says there's a lot out there, but you have to look at it. And Emerson imagined himself as what he called a transparent eyeball. Emerson is generally considered the father of American transcendentalism, 1840s in America, that he himself had no substance, so therefore he was transparent. All his senses were visual. He saw all, but could not be seen. That is, he was not himself of interest for people to look at or comment on. I'm not talking about in the personal sense. He was a recorder and not someone who was going to write autobiography. Of the Emersonian trait is Walt Whitman, who, unlike Emerson, did write about himself and had a larger-than-life personality. But Whitman is someone who also believed that the ordinary demanded unblinking attention. And so did Thoreau, three of the great transcendentalists at mid-century. But there's another figure in American literature, and appropriately a female, in Emily Dickinson, who was not a transcendentalist, but did believe that the ordinary demanded unblinking attention. Unlike Emerson and Whitman, who believed that the ordinary demanded that attention because the extraordinary was behind it if you would just look. You didn't need to go whaling. You didn't need to travel around the world. You could be in your own Walden Pond and see a miracle in a raindrop. That's what Whitman and Emerson and Thoreau believed. Emily Dickinson thought that the world, the ordinary world, demanded unblinking attention because there wasn't enough stuff to go around. And so you had to be very solicitous of any sensation, anything you could hold on to, because things were always departing. Ruthie has an Emersonian sensibility married to a Dickinson appreciation of the world. One of the things she talks about is she finds that when you want something, you sense its loss. She says at one point that memory is the sense of loss. Well, that's an odd thing because many people would think memory is the sense of recovery, that you remember because you're getting something back. You are collecting again, you are creating again, recreating, recollecting. She says memory is the sense of loss. That's page 194 in my volume. And later on in the novel, she feels that she's breaking the tethers of need. She's breaking the tethers of need that she is trying to develop in her own pre-adolescent, adolescent way, a kind of American abstinence in very much the Dickinson vein. And these aspects of the novel were only noted well after the novel first came out. I'm going to stop for a moment, since I'm at my 20-minute mark, and say that this combination of her having a great sensual perception of the world around her and a fertile imagination where she can imagine the lives of people she hasn't met or didn't know before her birth, marks her as a kind of authorial figure. I don't mean that the novel is autobiographical, but it's always a great thing about a character in a work of literary fiction when they can imagine to the extent of making a story seem believable. So I'm going to stop there. I know that's a lot. And I'm wondering if any of what I said resonates with anyone who read the book and saw any of those aspects, whether it's the loss or the attention to the ordinary or the transcendental embracing of nature, or especially this Emily Dickinson sense that the world is not a world of plenty. It's a world of deprivation and scarce resources, and you have to pay attention so as not to miss what you can get. Okay, Michael, I'm going to stop there.
Okay, folks, any comments? Pop them in there, and I'll relay them to Mark. So one person is asking, what does the title mean, housekeeping?
Well, everybody knows what the title means. Housekeeping is taking care of a house. And in 1980, there's no one who, I didn't mean that to be glib. She called it housekeeping because she expected anyone picking up the book written by a woman in 1980 and having a begin with "My name is Ruth" and finding out that there's a Helen and there's a Lucille, decidedly female names, is going to think, oh, this is a novel about women and domesticity. And it turns out after the grandmother goes, nobody's particularly good about keeping house. It turns out that although they were told keep the house in the larger sense of it's important, they not only don't want to keep it, they can't lose it. They try to burn it and it doesn't burn. A remarkable thing in this book is that there's a flood that doesn't do any significant damage to their house. And they try to set the house on fire and they're unsuccessful. And we know from the Bible, which has been brought into the novel with "My name is Ruth," that the world could be destroyed by flood. As I said, Noah's wife is referred to several times in the novel. And then a promise that that would never happen. The next time it's going to be the fire next time, as has been quoted. And so this novel kind of wittily plays on the notion that the house can't be destroyed by flood or by fire. But in the broader sense of the novel, we have two women, one an adult, one an adolescent, who are not interested in keeping house, who are not interested in keeping the house, and are not interested in doing the work of upkeep. They together burn lots of things, possessions, and later on they together try to burn the house. They retreat to the woods. Sylvia's name, after her mother, is a name, Sylvan means wooded, after the Sylvanus, the god of the woods. So Sylvia has a name that's associated with the countryside. They gravitate to the lake. They gravitate to the woods and not the house. And obviously in the 1950s, anybody would say, like the women who come to visit and sort of tisk about the condition of the home, women shouldn't be out on a lake or a freight car or sleeping on a park bench. They should be keeping house. That's what the title means.
Got it. All right, folks, hang on. Get your comments and questions in there. I'll throw one in there, Mark. One of the things I thought about a bit as I read this book, and as I mentioned to you, I did read it. I didn't study it, but I did read it. The idea of the transient drifter, and then keying on your idea of the Emily Dickinson being concerned that there's a scarcity of sort of amazing experiences, so you got to be very careful to catch them while you can. And I thought about the guys in On the Road getting their kicks. So what do you think about? I kept thinking about On the Road when I read this.
Yeah. So I want to say it's a natural thing to think of On the Road when these two women set out to be transients, but it has nothing in common with that novel. First of all, for two women to take to the road and freight trains in 1950s America is a very risky thing to do, not only in terms of their their safety, but in terms of any kind of reputation. And so it's a remarkable thing that Sylvie is a kind of transient and convinces Ruth. And if Ruth were naive, and maybe some people think she is, and they think that she's being preyed upon by this hand. But I think we're supposed to understand that Sylvie, for reasons we don't understand, and Ruthie, for reasons we do, since we're inside her head for the entire novel, are wired differently. And they want to be out on the open road. And in that way, they do touch on a great American novel theme, which is the tension between the misfit or outsider, despite being an insider. The outsider is insider, in tension with the community. So we have Hester Prynne as a great example of such a misfit, Huckleberry Finn in terms of great American novels, Ishmael in Moby Dick, who comes up from New York and goes on a sailing adventure, even though he is not experienced. And then in some of the novels we've looked at over the last couple of years, Benji is an outsider in Sound and the Fury, a member of the family, but not connected. Several of the characters in The Heart of is a Lonely Hunter have that sense of feeling isolated. Certainly Bigger Thomas in Native Son, who winds up executed. Holden Caulfield in Catcher in the Rye, who winds up being institutionalized. And Heather Motes in Wise Blood, who winds up being killed by police violence. There's a rich tradition of the outsider, but I'm going to say those names again. Benji, the characters in Heart as a Lonely Hunter, Bigger Thomas, Holden Caulfield, and Hazel Mote, not women. And that's one of the things that is distinctive about this book. When people talk about an Emersonian transcendental consciousness, they're thinking about men. Thoreau, Whitman, Emerson, they're not thinking about women. And Marilyn Robinson, who has a rich background in Christian theology and is very well read in lots of texts of philosophy, Bible, and classic literature, she is reworking the notion that let's make a character who can be a 20th century American transcendentalist, and let's make her not a sage of Concord, but a kind of quirky woman who's going to take her niece out in a stolen boat that doesn't leak all that much and is enchanted by trains. It's a remarkable accomplishment. And if she has a kind of individualism, it's the individualism of Anne Hutchinson. So I'll say something now about that remarkable figure in American history, who was born in 1591 and lived to 1643 in the colonies. So the Congregationalists who settled New England and who contributed their books to the library that became Yale in the beginning, they were Congregationalists in that they did not think that they needed a pope like the Roman Catholic Church. They did not need a cardinal or bishop like the Anglican Church. They didn't need a presbyter, a kind of overlord representative like the Presbyterian. All they needed was a group of people to say, we're the church and we'll decide. Very New England, very American. America was formed on the deck of the Mayflower by a group of people who made a contract, the Mayflower Compact. And one of the ways they identify themselves as Americans is they said, these are the people who are part of the compact. Everybody else on the ship, not just the crew, but other people who are coming to the New World, you're not part of the deal. And very tellingly, they name themselves saints, which isn't as self-promoting as it might sound. They were the chosen, they were the religious people. But more tellingly, they referred to everyone else on the ship as a stranger. So you have saints and strangers. And the beginning of division in America, whether it's cowboys and Indians or red states and blue states, or whether it's black and white, or take your North and South, began in America, not only before there was an America, but before the Pilgrims landed on Plymouth Rock. They defined themselves by who they excluded. They excluded outsiders who weren't part of their church. So Anne Hutchinson comes along and says, I like this idea that any number of people can form a compact and be their own church, be their own congregation. She wondered, is there a minimum number of such people? Well, what's it take to make a church? And they said, well, we haven't really thought that through. And she said, I'm making this up to make a dramatic point. Could it be 5 or 6? I suppose. How about 1? Can it be 1? No, Anne, if you do that, we're going to have to throw you out of town. Anne Hutchinson argued by logic and faith that if a group of people can be their own law, why can't a single person be her own law? They said no, and she was exiled. Like Ishmael in the Bible, she was cast out. She went on to have a good life in Boston and flourished, but the antinomian crisis, that is anti against and nomian, the rules, blew up when someone said, why can't I be my own church? Emerson comes along some 200 years later and writes an essay called Self-Reliance, in which he argues for very much the same thing. And what I'm saying is that Marilynne Robinson has fashioned in this book a couple, aunt and niece, who become self-reliant because one of them has a history of stepping outside convention, that's Sylvie, about whom we don't know a whole lot. And one of them has this remarkable gift for being connected to both the spiritual world and the world of nature. She says at one point, Ruthie, in the book, and this is in chapter 8, it's on page 152 again in this edition. She imagines how there can be a flowering of things in a garden, peaches and grapes, where the world had salt before. She says, for need can blossom into all the compensation it requires. Need can blossom into all the compensation it requires. To crave and to have are as like as a thing and its shadow, suggesting that craving is a kind of possession, that if you have a thing, it's going to have a shadow. For when does a berry break upon the tongue as sweetly as when one longs to taste it? And when is the taste refracted into so many hues and savors of ripeness and earth? And when do our senses know anything so utterly as when we lack it? I want to say this is one of the most important passages in the novel, not just because I say so, although, show me a little respect, and not just because I think this is a skewed view of the book. This is the heart of the book. Ruthie somehow has developed into somebody who believes that understanding comes through not having. This is the epistemological heart of Emily Dickinson's great poetry. Emily Dickinson was brought up in a Calvinist community. She believed that God was good and that God made good things, but she didn't think he made many good things. And she was raised in a tradition that the elect, those who are going to be saved, are not just elect, but select, that the saved are very few. Somewhere along the line, Puritan teaching came up with the idea that no matter how good you are, there's a quota, and you well may not make it. And Emily Dickinson said, if I can't have, maybe my craving, maybe my desire will be enough to keep me company. And she said in one of her poems, which is titled with its first line, I had been hungry all the years. So anyone interested in pursuing this can write down, that's the title of the poem I'm going to excerpt right now. I had been hungry all the years. She talks about standing outside a building where there's a feast going on of wine and bread, and that she has been raised on the countryside and only had a crumb or a berry to sustain her. And she has a powerful appetite to have the whole loaf and to have that berry turn into wine. And when she's invited in, she finds that she's no longer interested. And the poem concludes, so I found that hunger was a way of persons outside windows, the entering takes away. So I found that hunger was a way of persons outside windows, the entering takes away. That's the Dickinson motto. That's the Dickinson strategy. Embrace the need, and it will blossom into its own compensation. So Ruthie has a connection to Lucille by leaving her. Ruthie goes back to look at the house every year. She has it in her absence. The absence becomes a presence to her. And those of you who've been with me for a while, or if there are people here this evening from any of my longstanding book groups, you know I'm fond of talking about ghosts in literature, where I don't just mean the apparition that we think of as commonly what's meant as a ghost, whether you believe in them or not, but the presence of something that's absent, like that finger bone lake is a kind of ghostly reminder of the death of the father, the grandfather, and the mother. Ruthie comes to flourish in the context of absences which are present to her. And that's a remarkable kind of economy. If we talk about home economics, right, Lucille goes off to live with the home economics teacher. Ruthie has figured out her own kind of housekeeping economics. And in leaving, she's staying there. And if that sounds mystical, that's the point. That one of the things that makes this a thoroughly American novel is that it is very much channeling 19th century transcendental ideas, that there's more to America than a bottom line or the mundane. If you look at the ordinary with unblinking attention, you will see wondrous things in the leaves of grass. Okay, that's another 20 minutes, it feels like. I'll pause there.
Well, actually, I got a couple of comments before your recent run of commentary about Emily Dickinson that are interesting. Can you explain a little more about why you think Emily Dickinson didn't have a transcendental nature? She has a dual nature, being both a spirit of nature with a capital N and also caught up in her Calvinistic past.
Yeah, I'm going to interrupt you to say, if that person's quoting me accurately, I don't doubt it, I misspoke. Emily Dickinson is very much a transcendentalist in seeing beyond the veil of reality, but she's not a transcendentalist with a capital T. For one thing, she never expressed a belief that there's actually something with a capital S, capital T out there. She has a sensibility that's not literal and not factual. I only meant to say she is not a transcendentalist, capital T. She's certainly not an optimist in the way that Whitman, Emerson, and Thoreau are. Thomas Carlyle, the Scottish historian and Victorian genius, working on the other side of the Atlantic, saw that he was working in the same transcendental vein as Emerson. He believed that history, Carlyle did, Thomas Carlyle, it's his wife that gave me the title for this series, We Two Are Here. Not personally, she used that expression. Thomas Carlyle said that the problem with talking about transcendentalism is that it only acknowledges one polarity of the world of spirit. If you believe that there's a God and transcendence and something like a heaven or providence or bounty or good, then you have to imagine the other polarity of destruction and degeneration and sinfulness, and if not a devil, something anti-God. And there was no word for that. So he coined the term descendentalism, not transcending this world to something higher, but going down into the muck of this world to something lower, descendental. That term did not catch on, despite the fact that I've invoked it along the Connecticut shoreline and other places for most of my adult life. His point was, you can't just say the transcendental world is all good thing. You have to recognize the other polarity. And he wrote in one of his notebooks, which are published, that there are days when he feels he is a god in nature, and there are other days when he feels he is a weed by the wall. Emily Dickinson is much more of a descendental character in that weed by the wall, that deprivation. Remember when Sylvie is being interrogated by the women who come to cluck and try to pretend, I think, that they're trying to be gracious, and what they want is they want the house to look better, and they really think that maybe Ruthie shouldn't be with Sylvia. And they say, she's sad, she looks sad. And Sylvie says, brilliant response, she is sad. Why shouldn't she be sad? Life is hard. She doesn't say this, but a lot of death around her. She lost her mother. She lost her grandfather. She's lost her sister, Lucille. She feels like a misfit. Why shouldn't she be sad? That sense of embracing the sadness, because when do we know something better than when we lack it, is a Dickinson descendental position. I hope that helps clarify.
That's great. That's really good.
But to the person who brought up that comment, absolutely a spiritual writer, absolutely. And in that poem I just referenced, I Have Been Hungry All the Years, when she talks about, I used to live in the woods and got by with a berry and a crumb, and then I was invited to come towards the table and have wine and bread. It's obvious when you read the poem that she's thinking about the Eucharist. She's thinking about the communion service and being invited to the bounty of the consolation of Christian religion. Come into the church, come to the table, which is what New England Christians call the board. They won't use the term altar because that's papist. Come to the communion table. And she realizes that she'd be overwhelmed by the prospect of salvation. She doesn't want to believe that she'll live forever. She's been bred on crumbs and berries, and she's afraid that she'll be overwhelmed by plenty. And so she realizes that hunger is a sensation you have outside, and when you're actually invited in to eat, it goes away. And I'm saying that Ruthie is that kind of figure, remarkably well presented in first-person narration. You see the movie that was made in 1987, and you see them wearing 1950s clothing, and the girls dressed in jeans and plaid jackets, and you get this feeling that, yes, this is really pre-1960s, pre-sexual awakening, certainly pre-feminist Eisenhower America. It's hard to believe that Robinson had the genius to create in this gangly, tall, naughty-haired girl a figure of Dickinson transcendentalism and this idea of making her need its own compensation.
Got it.
Yeah.
So this one also links into something you just said about the women visiting the house. I thought of On the Road also, and of Huck Finn lighting out for the territories and freedom. What bothered me about this novel was what seemed to me a false choice between the highly conventional life represented by the elderly ladies who come to visit and the life of a hobo. There must be something in between, even in American life.
Yeah, there is, but that's another book. that person should write another book. Just because a writer decides not X but Y, not A but Z, doesn't mean there aren't wells between it. I don't think we can criticize a character in the book by saying, I don't want this or I want that, if by saying, oh, there are lots of other choices, right? But once you make one, that's the choice you've made. And I do think it's important to realize the sort of otherworldliness, the sort of philosophical existential complexity of making satisfaction out of need. So I want to say, when she says at the bottom of 152, this is Ruthie, when do our senses know anything so utterly as when we lack it? And here again is a foreshadowing. The world will be made whole. This is Ruthie. Now, maybe Ruthie is recalling this many years later, and she's not an adolescent when she expresses that statement. But making the world whole in a novel that talks about the deluge and Cain and Abel, that the first act was an expulsion and a failed flood and a failed conflagration, this is a novel that may suggest such people may be the salvation of the world. She says, to continue on page 152 to the top of 153, for to wish for a hand on one's hair is all but to feel it. To wish your hand on your hair is all but to feel it. So whatever we may lose, very craving gives it back to us again. That is, we can savor it in its absence by thinking of it. Though we dream and hardly know it, longing like an angel fosters us. That's her grandfather's last name, Foster. Longing like an angel fosters us, smooths our hair, and brings us wild strawberries. My point is not that you have to become a true believer. My point is, this is not just a feminist novel about a woman who doesn't want to dust. This is a novel about a young girl who remarkably has the sensibility of getting by with nothing. Emily Dickinson has a poem in which she talks about success is counted sweetest by those who ne'er succeed. To comprehend the nectar requires the sorest need. And she says that to understand the nectar, you have to need it and not have it. And that nobody on the fallen field of battle understands the poignancy of victory as the one wounded who hears the trumpet off in the distance. This is not the Protestant work ethic. If at first you don't succeed, try again. This is a spiritual calculus that says, I tried and didn't do it, but I have it anyways in my trying, my craving, my desire, my imagining. A very, very powerful American in a minor key. You're not going to get a lot of Fortune 500 CEOs to say, sounds like I should be reading Emily Dickinson. Nope, maybe not.
Well, one more Emily Dickinson reaction. Maybe this is relevant to the relationship of the main women characters to their society. Emily, she says, this attendee says, Emily Dickinson wrote, quote, the soul selects her own society and then shuts the door.
Yep. Right. And Emily Dickinson felt that one issue of Emersonian philosophy and the work of the transcendentalist was that in creating different ways of looking at nature, of God, of salvation, didn't change the problem of how intractable the world was. And one of her favorite lines that I think is from a notebook, not from one of her poems, but I can't swear to that. You could Google the line. The line is, to multiply the harbors does not divide the sea. To multiply the harbors does not divide the sea. How can you not love this woman for the succinctness of that insight. Just because you have harbors all over the northeastern shoreline, it may be fine for mooring a boat. It doesn't make the sea any more manageable. And in her view, that's what these attempts at different kinds of taming the unknowable. Emily Dickinson forms one of the great poles of American literature opposite Whitman and Emerson and Thoreau. And on her side, you'd have to put somebody like Edgar Allan Poe, who also had a transcendental spiritual sense of things, but he was with the weed by the wall. He was at the other end. He was talking about madness and horror and disappointment, harsher than the Emily Dickinson camp, and not as not in a tradition of Puritanism that Emily Dickinson was touched by, even though she didn't embrace it. I'll say by way of a plug that when I start doing my website courses in the fall, and I'll be advertising that with the help of anyone who wants to know, one of the people I'm going to be teaching in one of those sessions is Emily Dickinson, the poetry of Emily Dickinson. And she and Poe form an important contrast to Emerson and Whitman.
That's great. So, any other final comments or questions by anybody? Feel free to knock them in there. We got about 5 minutes left.
So I can add another point. So I mentioned that Foster was the grandfather's name. Fisher is Ruthie's father's name. And of course, Fisher has a religious dimension in the Fisher of Men, the Fisher King. It's associated with water. They go out in a rowboat that I'm sure the person whose boat it was would use for fishing. You might say that they're out to get an aquatic sense of the world, trains and boats. And another family name is Stone, which gives a sense of the purely elemental. But to give a contrast between the grandmother, who is not a negative figure, very competent woman, but doesn't give any traction to Ruth, when she's given as a gift that pocket watch that you cannot tell time by, and has two seahorses painted by the very good painting of her husband. It says he gave, this is near the bottom of page 12, early on in the novel, he gave it to her as a pendant with a chain through it, but she hardly ever wore it because the chain was too short to allow her to look at the seahorses comfortably. Now you can say, why not get a longer chain? Good question. She worried that it would be damaged on her belt or in her pocket. For perhaps a week, she carried the watch wherever she went, even across the room. And it was not because Edmund had made it for her, or because the painting was less vivid and awkward than his paintings usually were, but because the seahorses themselves were so arch, antic, and heraldic, and armored in the husks of insects. She's intrigued by the painting of the seahorses. It was the seahorses themselves that she wanted to see as soon as she took her eyes away. So let's pause for a moment. As soon as she stops looking at the seahorses, she wants to see them. Just the opposite of making your craving its own fulfillment. And it says, and that she wanted to see them even when she was looking at them. The wanting never subsided until something came up to interrupt her. That's a remarkable throwaway sentence. The grandmother can't get enough of her fascination with the seahorses, even when she's looking at them. It is appetite that cannot be sated even when you're eating. Just the opposite of the calculus, the methodology that Ruth has worked out for herself. part of the American way of doing things is don't eat till your appetite, hunger goes away. Just eat because you like to eat. And when you stop eating, eat more. The grandmother wants to see the horses even when she's seeing them, the seahorses. I think that's Marilyn Robinson's comment on the problem of consumerism in the broadest sense, not just buying things, but not getting enough of stuff, even when you have it. In Madame Bovary, you know that Emma Bovary is not long for this world when she gets upset when her lover comes to visit her, because when he comes, he interrupts her fantasies of being with him. It sounds like a black comic joke. She doesn't like his visits to have sex because it interrupts her fantasies about having sex with him. That is to say, her desire becomes its own companionship in the same way that grandma doesn't get satisfied by the seahorses even when she's looking at them. And by contrast, Ruth is fulfilled by things through their absence. I'm going to leave it at that since we're near the top of the hour. I sincerely hope that some of this made sense to you all, especially maybe to those of you who aren't as familiar with Emerson and Dickinson. But if nothing else, I hope I've shown that there's a lot more to this novel than a couple of women going off on the road, or again, a kind of eccentric marching to a different drummer aunt. It has a lot to say about American ethos, which is what this series is about.
Well, I think you did that, Mark. Certainly, I got a much deeper appreciation of the book from this, and I hope everyone else did too. And also, have got other things to look into. You've given us different trains of thought to go following. So, thank you for that, and thanks for attending, everybody. And we'll see you all next Thursday.
And I'll just say that the house on Mango Street also talks about desire, about a family wanting a house on Mango Street. But in contrast to this novel, which looks like a regular novel, it has a narrator, it has 11 chapters, it seems to be set in a real time and place. The House on Mango Street breaks a lot of conventions of the novel. If any of you have read it before, or any of you have begun to read it, you will see that it is nothing like what we expect the novel to be, which is part of the point of Sandra Cisneros. She doesn't just want to give us a different message, she wants to give us a different medium. So we'll talk about that next time. Thank you all again. Don't breathe too deeply unless the air is good. That's what I say. Have a good night. Thanks.
Okay, good night, everybody. Thanks. We'll see everybody next week.